Hello, and thank you for inviting me to give this keynote address for the conference today. I'm really pleased to be with you and to be able to talk a bit about the topic of developing real-world evidence from real-world data, and I will cover a number of different items related to not only the caveats and considerations for how we have to approach using real-world data, but also a little bit about how we think and have been thinking more recently about the need to not only develop algorithms with those items in mind, but then go on and monitor them for continuous learning in an AI-driven future. For those who don't know me, I am Peter Embí. I am currently the president and CEO of the Regenstrief Institute, a professor and associate dean at the Indiana University School of Medicine, and associate director of the Indiana Clinical and Translational Science Institute, as well as the vice president for learning health systems at Value Health. But I will be in this role for just a short period of time because, as you might have heard, I will be moving, and as of January 1st, I am pleased to say I will be the incoming chair of the Department of Biomedical Informatics at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. The goal of what we do in health informatics and health IT is ultimately to improve human health, whether that's improving healthcare or population health or enabling research. And we have a traditional focus on improving the work that clinicians and hospitals and clinics and payers do as they traffic in that information. Research, of course, is our evidence base, and there are increasingly more and more aspects of so-called research that are happening at the point of care and allow us to leverage a lot of the infrastructure and data capabilities. This is what is behind the concept of creating learning health systems, and many papers have been written about this, as well as initiatives to be able to advance not only the improvement of evidence-based medicine, but also the generation of evidence through practice. And so efforts like precision medicine initiatives, the All of Us program in the United States, the CTSA program, patient-centered outcomes research initiatives, and of course many international initiatives have been focused on this. However, despite these many initiatives and investments in the creation of learning health systems, we still have challenges. We know that we have many existing data that we should be able to leverage for research and quality improvement initiatives, and we want to be able to leverage clinical phenotypes and develop those phenotypes to have them be consistent across sites, to be able to leverage the information about disease and care outcomes. There are many administrative and fiscal variables, biomolecular markers, and increasingly patient-reported variables and social determinants of health that we want to leverage. But we have challenges, including that the data are often collected, stored, for clinical and administrative purposes, not for research purposes. It is to answer questions like this and to address the caveats for the use of operational EHR data that colleagues and I, led by Bill Hirsch, wrote an article years ago on this topic. For instance, as depicted in this diagram, if the question that you want to answer is, was a particular medication administered to a patient, then you have to recognize that you need to be pulling data in from multiple different sources in order to be able to do that, and then ultimately achieve some kind of a representation of what is actually true with regard to that activity. But as is depicted on the left, there are many potential sources for inaccuracy in the data. EHR data often don't tell a complete story about what's going on with the patient. Many of the data have been transformed or coded for purposes other than research and clinical care. The data are often captured in clinical notes, and text notes may make it challenging to recover some of the information for research, although, of course, NLP approaches are improving. And EHRs may present multiple sources of data that affect data provenance. Data granularity in EHRs may not match the needs of researchers. And of course, there are differences between conducting research via a organized and very rigid protocol versus how it is we go about providing care and the results of that on the data. In a more recent publication, colleagues and I addressed this in greater detail in this article entitled Developing Real-World Evidence from Real-World Data, Transforming Raw Data into Analytical Data Sets. In this article, we further explore the idiosyncrasies inherent in the capture, formatting, and standardization of EHR data and discuss the clinical domain and informatics competencies that are required to transform the raw clinical real-world data into fit-for-purpose analytical data sets. What's important to realize in this example from that paper is of a Venn diagram looking at the different proportions of characteristics in two different sites, two different health systems, for the phenotype of diabetes mellitus type 2. The differences in ratios have to be taken into account because these site-level differences in proportions of patients with different markers of disease can be accompanied by differences in other characteristics that can also have impacts on the performance of predictive algorithms. So if you develop it in one site and then you apply it in another, you can tell that you're probably going to have different performance, and that needs to be considered and accounted for. So there have, of course, been many efforts to address these challenges, and initiatives such as those depicted here that I won't go through in detail in the interest of time have tried to address many of the kinds of challenges that we face. But progress is still very challenging. We know that many of these difficulties are technical, but not all. Many are socio-organizational, regulatory, cultural, and otherwise. And so creating learning health systems still faces a lot of headwinds. The fundamental problem is that we have a flawed research practice paradigm. We haven't quite decided how we feel about conducting research at the point of care. On the one hand, we are counting on it. We are investing in the ability to leverage these data. But on the other hand, we still practice medicine in a way that is primarily about clinical care. And if we want to really be able to conduct research and systematically learn, we need to recognize that there is a different paradigm in mind. One reason for this disconnect is the traditional path of generation of evidence to its application, which is dictated by evidence-based practice. And this is a diagram of the right way to do evidence-based medicine, where you generate evidence on the left, and you synthesize the evidence, develop policies, apply those, and then take into account the patient's circumstances, evidence, and patient wishes to make a decision. The problem with this is that it is unidirectional. And so informed by that unidirectional nature, we have to recognize it and realize that in fact today, clinical care and research activities are quite distinct. They overlap mainly at that application of evidence to practice. But we know that that is no longer what we want. What we want is to be able to have a virtuous cycle, but the persistence of this paradigm does impede progress. Examples of the effects of that persistent paradigm, though, are all around us. Again, research is too often an afterthought when we are implementing our electronic health record systems, when we're designing our underlying data structures, and when we're trying to then use those data, or even how we pay for practice. So organizational and regulatory confusion from this flawed paradigm often results as well, where we pit one ethical imperative, let's say the ethical imperative of patient privacy, with the ethical imperative of advancing research, and it leads to a lot of wasted investment. We often don't include research considerations when we are deploying these systems, and then we expect IT or informatics to come along and fix that, but we often don't prioritize that either. So what's the answer? So as many have been saying for some time, the answer is that we need to go from a unidirectional flow to a cycle, as depicted in the diagram here, where we recognize that clinical care activities are not entirely distinct from research activities, that we have to consider evidence-generating medicine when we practice to advance science and care, that there are in fact many evidence-generating medicine activities ongoing, and that it's key to completing the evidence-based medicine lifecycle. So we want practice that generates evidence and that then applies evidence back to practice. And there are, of course, multiple enabling factors and stakeholders that have to play a part in this. This has, in fact, been reported and considered even over a decade ago at the United States National Coordinator for Health Information Technology, when our colleague and friend Dr. Chuck Friedman was the chief scientific officer there. He led a paper on the idea that once we have an interconnected network of electronic health record systems, we should be able to leverage those not only for improvements in practice, but also for biomedical research, public health, and healthcare quality improvement. And others have written about the need for these virtuous cycles, such as this article by Tenenbaum and colleagues, looking at how informatics approaches allow us to take care that informs research and research that informs care, in this case with a focus on precision medicine. With this in mind, I've been working for many years on the creation of local learning health systems and wrote an article about our early experience with this at in Columbus, Ohio, in the United States, on leveraging information systems to learn from every patient, and this was an example of that. And then my colleagues and I took and wrote a thought piece in JAMA in 2016 on the idea of creating local learning health systems as distinct from national learning health systems and why they are different but need to be considered. The idea then is that if we have local learning health systems, we realize that there are, of course, informatics and health IT considerations, people and cultural issues, systems and workflow issues, and then issues around fiscal and incentive factors. And once we create examples of our local learning health systems which have to be tailored to the local needs, we can begin to interconnect these and create regional and ultimately national, and who knows, someday maybe even international learning health systems. In fact, we recently wrote up our experience in Indiana of creating an Indiana Learning Health System initiative. I won't go into this in detail, but what you can see on the right is a depiction of the many collaborators with the Regenstrief Institute facilitating this in the middle, and this was led by Dr. Titus Schleier and colleagues, and I was the senior author on this, so I put the citation there for you as well, so you could read more about that experience. We published that this summer. Now, what we really want to accomplish then is to create a virtuous cycle of evidence generation and application, where we study linkages between molecules and populations, we develop tools and methods to better enable evidence generation, we build bridges between health systems and research activities to be able to do more of this at the point of care, and we implement and study those solutions in the healthcare environment, working with our IT colleagues to be able to do so. And as depicted on the right, if we think about our healthcare ecosystem representing clinicians and patients and families and communities, then we generate a lot of evidence, or rather data, that then makes its way into electronic health records, other emergent data sources, and as we've learned with COVID, of course, very rich public health information sources as well. We then can take those and integrate them using our informatics approaches and make them available to researchers and educators and policymakers, ultimately turning those back into actionable knowledge, analytics, and decision support tools that can go back to improving the healthcare ecosystem. And as professionals in informatics, this is really our obligation. We need to be doing more of this kind of work to study how it is that we should actually be enabling evidence-generating medicine. How do we go about designing and developing systems and approaches that facilitate practice and learning, reconcile and clarify regulatory and policy and ethical concerns, and then create virtuous cycles that can lead to advances in healthcare as well as quality research and overall health. So that takes me to the last part of the talk, which is to discuss, as we increasingly recognize the development of algorithms in healthcare, we have to think about how it is we go about not only developing these, as we've been talking about, and the caveats there, but also when we deploy them, what's going to happen? And so with the growth in algorithm-driven healthcare decision support and the ongoing development of these tools, we want to look into the future for a learning system and say, how does that apply to AI-driven healthcare? And I think we can draw an analogy from clinical trials about how we could think about this. So when I started thinking about this a few years ago, it occurred to me that we have phases when we think about clinical trials for drug development that could be applicable to algorithm development and deployment. So as I'm sure many of you know, we conduct phased studies where the early ones are about safety, and then phase 2 is for efficacy, phase 3 is for testing effectiveness of drugs or devices, and then ultimately in the United States we apply for FDA approval and then get those into the market and have post-marketing surveillance where we monitor what's happening. If we take that same approach and think about the science that was developed around that, we call that Pharmacal Vigilance. It's the science related to the collection, detection, assessment, monitoring, and prevention of adverse effects with pharmaceutical products. And in fact, there are processes for discovering those adverse effects, for systematically surveilling and understanding what is happening in the world once we deploy these pharmaceuticals and devices. And increasingly, we are leveraging EHRs for that. And as is shown on the right, there are different approaches for how those adverse effects get reported, how they're coded, determinations of seriousness, determinations of expediting the reporting and aggregating the information. If we take that same approach and think about it with regard to not drugs but algorithms, we can say that algorithm vigilance is also necessary, and this was the topic of a paper that I wrote earlier this year on the concept of advancing methods to analyze and monitor artificial intelligence-driven healthcare for effectiveness and quality via an approach called algorithm vigilance. And the idea here is that we, in an analogous way, would have scientific methods and activities related to the evaluation, monitoring, understanding, and prevention of adverse effects of algorithms in healthcare. Because if we know anything, it's that we're going to have unintended consequences, and so we need to be monitoring for those. And this is going to become increasingly important as AI and machine learning derived algorithms are used. Why do we need to do this? Well, as we've been talking about, we know there are biases in the data and we know there are variations. Some of those are known and many are unknown. And so we have to monitor for these things because as best as we might think we are accounting for those differences, we often don't know them until they appear. We also have to be cautious about generalizability. Just because we can apply an algorithm in one location and it works, that doesn't mean it's going to apply in another. And think back to the example I gave of the diabetes phenotype algorithm, where because of different characteristics, the phenotypic algorithm might behave differently in a different site. Again, unexpected results are what we can expect, and so we have to monitor for those. Monitoring promotes trust. It promotes trust among the health systems that are using these algorithms, as well as among patients and the public. And we need new systems and approaches in order to be able to do this. And fundamentally, we have to do this because it is essential for safe, efficient, and effective care. And so if we think about that in the context of a learning health system virtuous cycle, we might think about it this way, where if you start on the left, we develop algorithms based on local data, we study and validate those in selected populations, and then we deploy them into the healthcare setting, monitor them, iteratively improve them, and then continue that virtuous cycle of continuous improvement so that we can make sure that the algorithms are having the effect we intend them to have. So with that, I will conclude my talk. I really appreciate, again, the invitation and opportunity to be here with you all, and I look forward to the next session where we can have a discussion and I can answer any questions you might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Embí. I'm going to ask a question. I'm here with Dr. Brandam. We are new in health informatics. So I would like to ask you, in relationship with the article you just showed, and what's your experience showing the potential of health informatics for changing patients' health for those who are new in health informatics?
Yes, thank you for that question. And it's great to be with you. The potential is enormous. We have an incredible opportunity with the data that are generated all the time through routine practice to be able to really learn what we can do better, not only for that patient, but for future patients. By better leveraging the data that are flowing around us all the time. I think we all recognize that there's great potential in that. The hard part, and what we need people like you to do, is actually figure out the processes to not only make those data more available and more accessible and better, not only for the care of that patient, but for downstream learning. And that involves really having this forethought to say, not only do we want to be able to bring great evidence to practice and take care of the patient who's in front of us. Of course, that's what we want to do first. But then in addition to that, what are the ways in which we need to position ourselves to collect better data at the point of care, but then do that in a way that recognizes that practicing medicine is hard and we can't necessarily make that more cumbersome or more time consuming. So that balance of being able to create much higher quality data through practice, be able to then leverage that and develop evidence and bring it back to care is an informatics challenge. And I think those challenges present opportunities for all of us. And I would say it's a really exciting time to be entering the field because we now have better data than we've ever had before. It's interconnected better than it's ever been before. We have fantastic standards to be able to leverage to use those data. And now with the advances in machine learning and artificial intelligence and those capabilities, we should be able to make huge advances, but there's still a lot of research to be done on how to do that well. So I think it's an exciting time, but there's a lot of work to do.
Thank you. You just mentioned a very important point about the quality of data, but considering we are full of data nowadays, there is a huge challenge to being able to transformate all this data in real information. I mean, to transformate the data in patients' outcomes. Am I clear?
Yes. No,
So
you're
what's
absolutely
your
right.
experience? What's your experience about this?
Well, it really, my experience is that it depends a lot on the question that's being asked and what it is you're trying to do. So when we work, and I have throughout my career worked with a lot of different clinicians and researchers to try to actually generate knowledge, information and knowledge from data. And when we do that, we often find that what seems simple at first, in terms of saying, for instance, in the example I gave from our paper, let's just find everybody in the system who has diabetes. That sounds like a relatively simple thing to do. Everybody who has diabetes should have a diagnosis code associated with them, and they should have certain medications and different things. But when you actually start to look at it, the ways in which that's documented in one system versus another vary. And so you really have to sit down with the data and try to understand that. Having said that, what we were really trying to emphasize in the paper is that the development of these phenotypic algorithms to be able to actually say, this is the phenotype of diabetes mellitus type 2 that we're going to use. We are, in fact, making progress in being able to do quite well in identifying who those people are. But when we then take that and apply it in a different site, my experience also is that it doesn't always perform the same way. So you have to not only figure this out, let's say at your hospital, and you might have really, really good performance of that phenotype algorithm at your hospital, and it might be working quite well. But then when you take that and move it even just across the city or certainly across the country, then you have to test it again, and you have to make sure that it's still performing the same way, because the data are different, the patients are different, the way that the practitioners record the data is different, and it's going to perform differently. And then I'll take it one step further and say, when that results in something like a decision support alert or something like that, the way that gets presented, where in the workflow that gets presented, is also going to change the way that people interact with the system. And so you have to monitor these things, because if you just assume that it's going to work the same way as it did in hospital A, when you move it to hospital B, you're going to be wrong. And then people can be harmed, and we don't want people to be harmed. So it requires ongoing monitoring. And this is the job of informaticians, to do all of those things.
Okay, Peter, so I have a question in relationship with the quality of data input. It's well known that we the physicians are very difficult to change our mind on the way to how to write down the health records. Do you have any experience of teach how to physicians have to write down the record for improve the way to input the data?
Sure, that's a great question. I'll give you a concrete example from earlier in my life. So I'm in addition to being an informatician, I'm a rheumatologist. So when I was practicing rheumatology at The Ohio State University, we had deployed our electronic medical record there. And the way we developed our templates for our most common disease, rheumatoid arthritis, we actually had every single doctor had their own template, their own version of that template, okay? That was the way we did it. And so the result of that, not surprisingly, is it was variable, right? It varied. But we realized that that was causing problems because we couldn't characterize our population. We didn't really know for sure exactly how many patients we had, how severe they were. We couldn't use the decision support tools as effectively because of the variation and a lot of other things. So we went through a process where we said, okay, can we develop one template for rheumatoid arthritis in our practice that we all agree to use? That has to have some flexibility, for people to do different things, but has also some standardization to it. And so we did that. We got together as a group. We said, these are the minimal data that we want. The initial list was like 500 elements, which was going to allow us to see like one patient a day, which wasn't going to work. So we made it very limited, and we restricted it to 50 data elements. Then we realized that of the 50, 43 of them were already in the record somewhere: medications, diagnoses, demographic information. So there were only 7 additional variables that really we had to collect at the point of care that were essential. And then not all of those had to be done by the physician. Some could be done by the nurse or the medical assistant, or even the patient through a pad, an iPad or something. So we then rolled that out, and it did not increase the length of the visit. It was the same, and it improved the data. And now everybody was happier because we could actually track our patients much better, and we could start to use decision support. And here's the important thing. Right away, when we made that change, we also had better information that we could pull into the note, so that when the doctor is seeing the patient that day, they also got the benefit of seeing trends and seeing things that could help them better take care of that patient that day. So it can't, the other lesson is that it can't only be for research that we're going to do in the future that we make these changes. It has to be for the patient care now, so that then people see the value in the change. And then people are happy with that.
Okay, so in relation with that, what about the new students of the university? They learn how to improve the way to write down the health records in this way for improve the data entry.
Yes, you're talking about like medical students or nursing students? Yes, yeah. I think so. I think that's really important. So I've actually created some courses and some lectures for our medical students and healthcare students to teach them. And I think one of the things that we often don't spend enough time on is we teach people how to use the electronic medical record kind of like in a very superficial way. You know, here's where you click to start a note, and here's how you actually order a lab. But that's not the same as the best practice. So if you think about learning how to drive a car by just saying, this is where the pedal is and this is where the steering wheel is, that's not really learning how to drive a car. That's learning how to open the door and start the car and steer it. But to learn how to drive a car, you go to driver's education, you get experience, and you actually learn the right way to do that. We have to do that with regard to what we teach, I think, our medical professionals in school for documentation too, because otherwise, they don't know that they're doing it in a way that is going to have downstream negative benefits. So because we have to recognize this, now we can start to infuse that into the curriculum. And I think that's a very important opportunity to say, if we want to use the data, then the data have to be good, which means we got to think about the way we're doing that in the first place. And that should become part of the curriculum.
Okay, thank you so much.
Hey, Paul. Looks like you're on mute.
Yes. Yes, Peter, first of all, I would like to thank you for always being a friend of us and, be able to participate in our meeting. I'm going to say something in Spanish because we have some people in the audience that are Spanish and you understand Spanish, so it's going to be easier. Bueno, yo creo que Peter de alguna manera resumió muy bien la responsabilidad y no tanto los desafíos que tiene la inteligencia artificial, porque como él bien decía, están los datos, se puede hacer, están los algoritmos, pero tenemos que hacerlo bien, precisamente para que la inteligencia artificial no vuelva a caer en sus inviernos, como se llama habitualmente. Y en la charla anterior, a la de Peter, que dio John Halamka de Mayo Clinic, mostró unas etiquetas como las etiquetas de los alimentos. Uno puede saber cómo está hecho ese algoritmo y que no sea una caja negra. Entonces, celebro que la charla de Peter se haya tomado el tema, más que nada desde el punto de vista de cómo la inteligencia artificial y los algoritmos retroalimentan este concepto de Learning Health System, que creo que tiene que estar por encima de todo. Y la inteligencia artificial, por más que ahora está de moda y todo el mundo la está haciendo, es una herramienta más que puede ayudar a tener un sistema de salud que sea de calidad, seguro y que también sea costo beneficioso. Así que Seguramente, Peter, entendiste todo lo que dije, por más que no te animás a hablar en castellano, pero lo entendés muy bien. Así que, once again, thank you very much for being here, and I hope the next year and next time we can have you again in Buenos Aires.
I look forward to visiting. Thank you very much.
A Julia y a Andrés para cerrarla.
Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, doctor Peter Embí, en nombre también de toda la audiencia y de mi compañero Andrés. Bueno, no nos mencionó que podía hablar y podía entender español, así que le pedimos disculpas por nuestro inglés muy primitivo y le agradecemos su presencia. Lo invitamos a participar nuevamente el próximo año.